Welcome to Javel Stories. Before we continue with the story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell to always get notified for upcoming stories, and also share the story with loved ones and friends. Thank you very much. In the heart of the flourishing Kingdom of Eldor stood the grand palace of King Adralis, a man revered for his wisdom and compassion. Eldor was a land of abundance, with rolling golden fields that stretched to the horizon, rivers that glimmered like liquid silver under the sun, and villages alive with the hum of trade and laughter. It was a realm where the people thrived under the king's steady hand, their bellies full and their hearts light. Merchants from distant lands would often marvel at the harmony of Eldor, a place where no one went hungry and disputes were settled with justice rather than violence. The palace itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, its white stone walls gleaming under the sunlight and its high towers standing sentinel against the azure sky. The garden surrounding it was a paradise of blooms, roses, lilacs, and vibrant wildflowers danced in the gentle breeze, filling the air with their sweet perfume. On most days, the laughter of the twin princes Jackson and Kevin could be heard echoing through the corridors. They were inseparable, their bond a source of joy to all who served in the palace. On the eve of their 5th birthday, the kingdom was alive with celebration. The villagers decorated their homes with garlands of fresh flowers, and the streets were filled with the aroma of roasting meats and spice pastries. Inside the palace, Queen Alara prepared a grand feast, her warm smile radiating love and pride. She was the heart of the family, her mere presence a balm to any sorrow. As night fell, she gathered her sons in the royal nursery, her voice soft as she sang them a lullaby. It was a song of hope and unity, her words wrapping them in a cocoon of peace. But as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, her gaze lingered at the window, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Even amidst joy, the shadow of fate loomed. The peace of Eldor shattered like glass when Queen Alara fell ill. Her once vibrant form grew frail, and her voice, which had once filled the halls with song, became a whisper of its former self. The royal healers tried every remedy known to them, but her condition worsened. The kingdom held its breath, united in prayer, but their pleas went unanswered. The day Alara passed, the skies wept with torrential rain, as though the heavens themselves mourned her loss. The funeral was a somber affair, the kind that left an indelible mark on all who attended. Thousands of villagers lined the streets, their heads bowed in respect. The royal family walked behind the queen's ornate casket, their faces pale with grief. The palace courtyard was transformed into a sea of flickering candles, their flames dancing in the wind as if trying to resist the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and a choir sang a dirge so haunting that it left even the most stoic knights wiping their eyes. King Adralis, though broken with sorrow, made a solemn vow that day. He would not remarry, for no one could replace Alara. Instead, he would devote himself to his sons, raising them to embody the values their mother had cherished. Yet, even as he made this promise, the weight of the future pressed heavily on him. Without Alara's guiding light, the path ahead seemed uncertain. Time, as it always does, began to heal the wounds left by Alara's death, though her absence remained a silent void in the royal household. Jackson and Kevin grew into spirited teenagers, their personalities beginning to diverge. Jackson took after his mother, his demeanor calm and compassionate. He spent long hours in the royal library, poring over books on governance and diplomacy. When he wasn't studying, he was often in the village, lending a hand to those in need. One day, he found an elderly woman struggling to carry firewood and sent palace servants to her aid. Acts like these earned him the love of the people, who saw him as a beacon of hope. Kevin, by contrast, was a whirlwind of energy and mischief. He was rarely seen indoors, preferring to roam the countryside on horseback or engage in sparring matches with the palace guards. His charm and wit made him popular among his peers, but his disdain for rules often put him at odds with the elders. Despite their differences, the bond between the brothers remained strong. Kevin admired Jackson's discipline, even if he couldn't emulate it, while Jackson saw Kevin's free spirit as a refreshing antidote to the rigid expectations of palace life. One summer afternoon, the twins raced their horses through the fields, their laughter carried on the wind. As they reached the crest of a hill, they paused to take in the view, the sprawling kingdom that would one day be their responsibility. Jackson's expression turned serious as he spoke of their duty to protect and serve their people. Kevin, leaning casually against his horse, laughed and dismissed the weighty talk, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. The seeds of doubt and comparison had begun to take root, though neither brother realized it yet. Far from the joyful laughter of the royal twins, another figure in the palace watched with cold calculation. Lord Malric, the younger brother of King Adralis. Malric had always resented his older sibling's ascension to the throne. Though Adralis was a just and capable king, Malric considered himself more deserving, sharper, more ambitious, and unburdened by sentiment. As years passed, Malric's jealousy turned into a festering grudge. While the kingdom adored Jackson and tolerated Kevin's mischief, Malric saw an opportunity. He observed Kevin closely, noting the younger prince's occasional frustration and his desire for recognition. "He has the makings of a tool," Malric muttered to himself one night in his chambers, the flickering candlelight casting long, sinister shadows on the walls. Malric began to lay the groundwork for his schemes, ingratiating himself with Kevin under the guise of a supportive uncle. He shared stories of his own struggles growing up in the shadow of Adralis, subtly planting seeds of doubt in Kevin's mind about his own position in the royal family. "It's not easy being the second choice," Malric would say with a rueful smile. "I've been there, overlooked, underestimated, but you're strong, Kevin, stronger than they realize." Kevin, craving validation and admiration, began to warm to his uncle. Unaware of Malric's true intentions, he found comfort in the man's words, which seemed to echo his own unspoken insecurities. The air in the great hall was heavy with anticipation as King Adralis summoned the elders, advisors, and key members of the royal court for an important announcement. The hall, adorned with banners of Eldor's golden sun emblem, was packed with villagers peeking through the arched doorways, eager to hear the king's words. Adralis, now older but still commanding respect, stood tall before his people. "My people," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "the time has come to name the heir to the throne of Eldor." He paused, his gaze falling upon Jackson and Kevin seated beside him. "Both my sons are dear to me, but the mantle of leadership requires more than lineage. It requires compassion, wisdom, and the ability to serve others selflessly." The room was silent as the king continued. "Jackson has demonstrated these qualities time and again. He has earned not only my trust but the love of the people. Therefore I name Jackson as my heir, the crown prince of Eldor." The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Elders nodded approvingly, villagers exchanged smiles, and even some of the court guards couldn't hide their satisfaction. Jackson, ever humble, rose and bowed deeply to his father. "I am honored, father," he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions surging within him. But not all eyes in the hall were filled with joy. Kevin sat frozen, his hands clenched into fists. His stomach churned with a mixture of emotions, pride for his brother, yes, but also a deep, gnawing sense of inadequacy. And in the shadows, Malric's lips curled into a knowing smirk. The first piece of his plan had fallen into place. That evening, the palace came alive with celebration. Musicians played lively tunes, and long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh fruits, and barrels of honeyed ale. Villagers danced in the courtyards, their laughter carrying into the night. Inside, the royal family hosted a grand feast for the nobles and elders, their smiles masking the undercurrents of unease. Jackson moved through the crowd with effortless grace, accepting congratulations from guests with humility. "You will be a fine king," an elder said, clasping his shoulder. Jackson simply smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. Kevin, on the other hand, was uncharacteristically quiet. He lingered on the edges of the hall, watching his brother bask in the adoration of the court. A glass of wine in his hand, he felt a pang of bitterness. He didn't begrudge Jackson his success, he loved his brother, but the unshakable feeling of being overlooked gnawed at him. Malric seized the moment. Approaching Kevin, he placed a hand on his shoulder, his tone dripping with feigned sincerity. "It's a grand night for your brother, isn't it? A future king to be proud of." Kevin nodded absently, but Malric leaned closer. "Still, it must sting a little, doesn't it? To always play second to Jackson." Kevin stiffened but said nothing. Malric's words, though subtle, hit their mark. For the rest of the evening, Kevin's thoughts were clouded, his uncle's insinuations taking root. Malric began his campaign in earnest, meeting Kevin in private under the guise of offering counsel. "You and Jackson are both strong, but the kingdom only sees him," Malric murmured during one of their late-night conversations. "You deserve recognition, Kevin. You could be a great leader, even greater than Jackson." Kevin resisted at first, insisting that he was content with his role. "Jackson is better suited for the throne," he said. "He's patient, wise, and loved by all." "But is that what you believe?" Malric pressed, "or what you've been told to believe? You are no less deserving, Kevin. They've just blinded you to your own potential." These conversations became more frequent, and Kevin began to entertain thoughts he had previously dismissed. As weeks turned into months, Malric's influence deepened. The once carefree prince now carried a shadow of doubt wherever he went. The bond between Jackson and Kevin, once unbreakable, began to strain under the weight of Malric's manipulations. Kevin grew quieter, more withdrawn, often excusing himself from family gatherings. Jackson, perceptive as ever, noticed his brother's distant demeanor and tried to reach out. One evening, as the sun set over the palace gardens, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jackson found Kevin sitting alone by the fountain. The water's soft trickle contrasted with the tension in the air. "You've been distant lately," Jackson said, his voice gentle. "Is something troubling you?" Kevin hesitated, staring into the fountain's rippling waters. "Nothing," he replied curtly, avoiding his brother's gaze. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on Kevin's shoulder. "You can always talk to me, Kevin. We're brothers. Nothing should come between us." Kevin forced a smile, but his thoughts were clouded. Malric's words echoed in his mind. "You'll always be second to Jackson." For the first time, Kevin felt the flicker of resentment toward the brother he once adored. Malric, sensing Kevin's growing vulnerability, decided it was time to escalate his plan. Late one night, he invited Kevin to his private chambers. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves of ancient texts and artifacts that gave it an air of mystery. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on Malric's face as he spoke. "Kevin, you're at a crossroads." Malric began pouring 2 goblets of wine. "You can continue living in Jackson's shadow, or you can step into the light and claim what should rightfully be yours." Kevin frowned, his fingers tightening around the goblet. "I don't want to harm Jackson," he said firmly. "He's my brother." Malric leaned forward, his expression grave. "Sometimes, sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Eldor needs a strong, decisive leader, not someone who hesitates and panders to the weak. You could be that leader, Kevin." For hours, Malric painted a picture of Kevin as a king, admired, powerful, and free of Jackson's overshadowing presence. Though Kevin resisted, Malric's words planted seeds of doubt that would soon grow into something far darker. Weeks later, the palace held a grand feast in honor of the royal family's successful negotiations with a neighboring kingdom. The hall was adorned with golden tapestries, and the scent of roasted lamb and spiced wine filled the air. Musicians played lively tunes, and laughter echoed through the great hall. But beneath the surface of celebration, Malric's sinister plan was reaching its climax. Malric approached Kevin before the feast, handing him a small vial of clear liquid. "Slip this into Jackson's goblet," he instructed. "It will look like he succumbed to illness, and no one will suspect a thing." Kevin stared at the vial, his heart pounding. "I can't do this," he whispered, panic evident in his voice. "He's my brother." Malric's eyes hardened. "Your brother? Or your rival? Do you think Jackson would hesitate if the roles were reversed? He'll take everything from you, your place, your future, your name." Act now, Kevin, or live in his shadow forever. Torn between loyalty and the poisonous whispers that had taken root in his heart, Kevin reluctantly took the vial. As the feast began, he slipped the poison into Jackson's goblet, his hands trembling. The hall was alive with merriment. But Kevin could barely hear the laughter over the deafening sound of his own heartbeat. The moment came when Jackson raised his goblet to toast the kingdom's prosperity. His smile, warm and genuine, lit up the room as he spoke words of gratitude and hope. Kevin's chest tightened as he watched his brother drink deeply from the goblet, the poisoned liquid slipping past his lips. Seconds passed like hours. Jackson's face suddenly contorted in pain, and he clutched his chest, gasping for air. The hall fell silent, the music halting mid-note. Gasps and cries erupted as Jackson collapsed, his goblet clattering to the floor, wine spilling like blood across the marble. "Jackson!" King Adralis shouted, rushing to his son's side. The king's cries echoed through the hall as he cradled Jackson's lifeless body, his grief raw and uncontainable. The room descended into chaos, nobles and servants alike shouting in confusion and horror. Kevin sat frozen, his face pale, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had done. That night, as Jackson's lifeless form was carried to the royal crypt, a piece of Eldor's light was extinguished. King Adralis, already weakened by age, could not bear the weight of losing his beloved son. In the days following Jackson's death, his health deteriorated rapidly. He withdrew from court, spending his days in Jackson's chambers, clutching his son's belongings and whispering prayers to the gods. Kevin, consumed by guilt, avoided his father's gaze. He spent hours wandering the castle halls, haunted by memories of his brother's laughter and the sight of his lifeless body. Malric, ever the manipulator, remained at Kevin's side, assuring him that what had been done was necessary for the kingdom's future. But Kevin found no solace in Malric's words. When King Adralis finally succumbed to his grief, collapsing in his chambers, Kevin felt the weight of the throne pressed down upon him. The villagers, already mourning Jackson, now grieved for their wise king. Whispers of suspicion spread like wildfire through the kingdom, but with no proof, the people could do nothing. Kevin's coronation was a somber affair, his crown feeling more like a shackle than a symbol of power. The joyous cheers that once accompanied royal ceremonies were replaced by the murmurs of discontent. The kingdom, once a beacon of prosperity and harmony, had begun its descent into darkness. Kevin sat alone in the grand throne room, the golden crown resting heavily on his brow. The once vibrant chamber, adorned with banners of Eldor's triumphs, now seemed hollow. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as if the throne itself sought to crush him. He had achieved the ultimate power, but the joy he imagined would accompany it was absent. Instead, the ghost of Jackson haunted his every thought. Outside the palace walls, the villagers whispered. They had adored Jackson, and the circumstances of his sudden death, coupled with King Adralis's rapid decline, stirred suspicions. The elders, though bound by loyalty to the crown, exchanged uneasy glances. Kevin's coronation, held in the shadow of mourning, felt more like a funeral procession than a celebration. Malric, ever the opportunist, stood by Kevin's side, his influence growing stronger. "You are the king now," he reminded Kevin in a voice smooth as silk. "The people may grumble, but they will fall in line. Show them your strength, and they will learn to respect you." Kevin nodded mechanically, but deep down he felt a growing void. The crown had cost him his brother, his father, and the love of his people. And yet he couldn't turn back now. In the months following Kevin's coronation, Malric's presence in the court became more pronounced. The once discreet advisor now openly wielded power, issuing commands and reshaping policies in his favor. Lavish feasts were held in the palace while the villagers struggled to make ends meet. Taxes increased, not for the benefit of the kingdom, but to fund Malric's extravagant lifestyle and ambitious schemes. Kevin, consumed by guilt and self-doubt, retreated into himself. He avoided court meetings, allowing Malric to assume greater authority. The villagers, who once looked to the throne for guidance and protection, now found themselves abandoned. Roads fell into disrepair, crops withered due to neglect, and the once thriving markets grew sparse. Among the villagers, discontent turned to anger. "This is not the kingdom Jackson would have led," they muttered. Kevin's name became synonymous with weakness and Malric's with greed. The harmony that King Adralis had built over decades was unraveling. One fateful morning, the first signs of calamity appeared. The skies, once clear and blue, turned a dull gray. Rain, which had always been plentiful in Eldor, ceased altogether. Streams dried up, and the fields that had once been the kingdom's lifeblood began to crack under the relentless sun. Farmers tried to save their crops, but the earth refused to yield. The chief priest of Eldor, a venerable figure named Eldrin, sought an audience with Kevin. Clad in flowing robes adorned with ancient symbols, Eldrin carried an air of authority that commanded respect. "My king," he began, his voice low but firm, "the gods are displeased. They have turned their faces from Eldor." Kevin shifted uncomfortably on his throne, avoiding Eldrin's piercing gaze. "What do you mean, priest?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Eldrin's expression darkened. "The spirits of King Adralis and Prince Jackson are restless. Their deaths were unnatural, and justice has not been served. The kingdom's suffering is a reflection of their wrath." Kevin's heart raced, but he forced a dismissive tone. "This is merely an unfortunate season, nothing more. The people will recover." Eldrin frowned but said no more. As he left the throne room, his words lingered like a storm cloud over Kevin's head. That night, Kevin's sleep was plagued by nightmares. He found himself standing in the royal crypt, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Before him stood Jackson, his once warm eyes now filled with sorrow and accusation. "Why, Kevin?" Jackson's voice echoed, a haunting blend of pain and betrayal. "Why did you let Malric turn you against me?" Kevin woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room seemed darker than usual, the shadows in the corners twisting unnaturally. A cold draft brushed past him, though the windows were shut. For the first time, Kevin felt the weight of the spirit's anger. Malric dismissed Kevin's fears as superstition. "They are dreams, nothing more," he said with a wave of his hand. "You are letting guilt cloud your judgment. Focus on ruling, and the people will come to respect you." But Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As days turned into weeks, the disturbances grew. Objects in his chambers moved on their own. Whispered voices echoed through the halls. Servants reported seeing shadowy figures in the corridors. The palace, once a symbol of power, now felt like a haunted prison. The drought tightened its grip on Eldor. Wells ran dry, and villagers began to abandon their farms, seeking refuge in the towns. Hunger spread like a disease, and riots broke out in the marketplace as desperate families fought over dwindling supplies. The villagers' anger turned toward the palace. "This is Kevin's doing," they shouted. "His reign has brought nothing but ruin." Murmurs of rebellion grew louder, though no one dared to act openly. Kevin, overwhelmed by the kingdom's collapse and the torment of the spirits, grew increasingly erratic. He lashed out at his advisors, blamed the villagers for their misfortunes, and isolated himself further. Malric, still in control, exploited Kevin's instability to tighten his grip on the treasury and military. But even Malric couldn't ignore the signs. "Perhaps we should consult the chief priest," he suggested one evening, his voice cautious. "Offer a sacrifice, appease the gods." Kevin glared at him. "You told me there was nothing to fear. Now you want to grovel to the gods?" "No. This is a test of my strength, and I will not yield." Eldrin, undeterred by Kevin's earlier dismissal, returned to the palace. His once calm demeanor was replaced by urgency. "The spirits grow stronger," he warned. "If you do not confess your sins and seek forgiveness, their wrath will consume not only you, but all of Eldor." Kevin's face twisted with anger and fear. "You speak of things you cannot prove. Priest, my rule will not be undermined by superstition." Eldrin's voice rose, his words thunderous. "Your father and brother's blood cry out for justice. You cannot silence the truth forever, Kevin. The gods see all." Kevin ordered Eldrin to leave the palace. But the priest's warning hung in the air. Deep down, Kevin knew the truth. His sins were catching up to him, and there was no escape. The drought worsened, and with it came eerie, unexplainable phenomena across Eldor. At night, villagers reported hearing whispers on the wind, voices lamenting the kingdom's fall. Crops withered not just from lack of rain, but from an unnatural blight, their once green leaves curling into blackened husks. Livestock fled their pens or perished inexplicably. It was as if the land itself had turned against its people. Within the palace, Kevin's torment grew. The shadows in his chambers seemed alive, stretching and twisting into forms that resembled his father and brother. The throne room, once a place of pride, felt suffocating. When Kevin sat upon the throne, he could hear faint voices, his father's calm, sorrowful tone, and Jackson's questioning whispers. One night, Kevin awoke to find his room bathed in an unearthly blue glow. At the foot of his bed stood the spectral forms of King Adralis and Jackson. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes piercing. Jackson stepped forward, his voice low but filled with an otherworldly resonance. "You betrayed me, Kevin. You betrayed us all." Kevin screamed, falling to the floor and clutching his head. The spirits disappeared, but their words echoed in his mind. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Malric, who had always dismissed the supernatural as mere folklore, began to experience the spirit's wrath as well. Late one evening, as he reviewed the kingdom's dwindling funds in his private chambers, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, and a chilling voice spoke his name. He turned to find the translucent figure of King Adralis standing behind him. "Your greed has poisoned this land," the ghostly figure intoned. "Your time is nearing its end." Terrified, Malric fled to Kevin, his arrogance shattered. "The spirits are real," he gasped, his face pale. "They came to me. They know what we've done." Kevin, already teetering on the edge of sanity, lashed out. "You brought this upon us," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty halls. "You planted the seeds of betrayal. This is your doing." But even as he blamed Malric, Kevin knew that he, too, bore the guilt. He had allowed himself to be swayed, to commit the ultimate betrayal against the brother who had loved him unconditionally. While Kevin and Malric grappled with their haunting torment, the people of Eldor reached their breaking point. Hunger and despair drove them to rebellion. Groups of villagers stormed the palace gates, their faces gaunt but determined. They carried crude weapons, pitchforks, clubs, and stones, and demanded justice. "The king has cursed us," they cried. "Bring back the reins. Bring back our lives." The royal guards, loyal out of duty rather than affection, managed to hold the mob at bay. But inside the palace, Kevin was paralyzed with fear. He watched from a high window as his people, once devoted and joyful, now cursed his name. The sight broke something inside him. For the first time, Kevin admitted the full weight of his failure. His reign had brought only suffering, and his guilt and weakness had allowed Malric to ruin everything his father had built. Eldrin, the chief priest, returned to the palace amidst the chaos. The rebellion raging outside seemed almost secondary to the priest's purpose. He entered the throne room, where Kevin sat slumped on the throne, his face pale, and his eyes haunted. Malric lingered nearby, pacing nervously. "King Kevin," Eldrin said, his voice calm but resolute, "the spirits demand atonement. Confess your sins before your people, and perhaps the gods will show mercy." Kevin's head snapped up, his eyes filled with desperation. "Will it stop?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Will they leave me alone?" Eldrin stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Your brother and father do not seek vengeance, they seek justice. Admit your wrongdoing, and the kingdom may yet be saved." Malric scoffed, stepping forward. "This is madness. Confessing will destroy us. We can still crush this rebellion, still rebuild." Before he could finish, the shadows in the room coalesced into the forms of Adralis and Jackson. Their spectral presence silenced everyone. Adralis's voice was heavy with authority. "Your time of lies is over, Malric. The gods will no longer tolerate your greed." Malric fell to his knees, trembling. Kevin stared at the apparitions, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was weak. I betrayed you, Jackson. I betrayed our father." The next day, Kevin stood before his people in the palace courtyard. The rebellion had been halted, but not through force. Word had spread that the king would speak, and the villagers gathered, their anger tempered by curiosity. Kevin, dressed in simple robes rather than his royal finery, looked out at the crowd. His voice cracked as he began. "My people, I have wronged you. I have wronged this kingdom, and I have wronged my family." He confessed everything, the poisoning of Jackson, the role Malric had played, and his failure as a king. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. When Kevin finished, he fell to his knees. "I beg your forgiveness, though I know I do not deserve it." The people were silent for a long moment. Then Eldrin stepped forward. "The spirits have been heard. Justice must be served." The Council of Elders decreed that both Kevin and Malric be stripped of their titles and banished from Eldor. The villagers watched as the two were led away, their heads bowed in shame. Kevin felt a strange sense of relief. The crown, which had once felt like a prize, now seemed like a curse lifted from his shoulders. As they crossed the kingdom's borders, Kevin turned back for one final look at the land he had betrayed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he knew the words would never be enough. The day Kevin and Malric crossed the borders of Eldor, dark clouds gathered over the land. For the first time in years, the skies opened, releasing a gentle rain that washed over the parched soil. Villagers ran into the streets, their faces turned upward, tears mixing with the rain as they laughed and danced. It was a miracle, an undeniable sign that the gods had heard their prayers. Eldrin, standing on the palace balcony, whispered a silent prayer of thanks. "The spirits are at peace," he said to the gathered council. But Eldor's healing has only begun. The rain didn't just quench the thirst of the land, it cleansed the people's hearts. The villagers who had grown bitter under Kevin's rule began to find hope again. Fields that had been barren showed the first signs of green shoots, and the rivers swelled with fresh, clear water. Inside the palace, the elders convened to discuss the future of the kingdom. Eldrin, though not a ruler himself, was looked upon as the kingdom's moral guide. "We must ensure that what happened under Kevin's rule is never repeated," he declared. "We need leadership that honors the legacy of King Adralis and Prince Jackson." The palace halls, once symbols of opulence corrupted by greed, were transformed into centers of activity. Artisans and laborers worked tirelessly to restore the infrastructure of the kingdom. Roads were repaired, irrigation channels were rebuilt, and abandoned farms were revitalized with communal effort. The villagers who had suffered the most found solace in working together. For Jackson, they would say as they toiled, his memory became a rallying cry, inspiring them to rebuild not just their homes, but their sense of unity and purpose. Eldrin traveled from village to village, spreading messages of hope and forgiveness. "The gods have given us another chance," he would tell the crowds. "Let us honor this by living with compassion and justice." The elders appointed a council of trusted leaders to oversee the kingdom's governance until a new heir could be determined. This collective leadership was a departure from tradition, but it brought stability in the wake of the turmoil. Far from the borders of Eldor, Kevin and Malric wandered aimlessly. Stripped of their titles and power, they were unrecognizable to those they encountered. Kevin's once pristine robes were now tattered, and his once confident demeanor had been replaced by quiet remorse. Malric, however, was unrepentant. "We could build another kingdom," he suggested one evening as they camped in a desolate forest. "You're still a king, Kevin. Your bloodline—" "Stop," Kevin interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm no king. I was a failure, a weak, selfish man who betrayed the only people who ever truly loved me." Malric scoffed, but the spark of defiance in his eyes began to fade. The hauntings hadn't stopped for them. Every night, the spirits of Adralis and Jackson appeared, their presence a constant reminder of the cost of their ambition. The torment wore on Malric, his bravado eroding into desperation. One night, after yet another haunting, Malric fled into the wilderness. Kevin awoke to find himself alone. For the first time in his life, he felt both completely free and utterly alone. With no companion and no destination, he began to walk, unsure of what lay ahead. Back in Eldor, the people decided to honor the memory of their fallen prince and king. At the heart of the main square, they erected a grand statue of King Adralis and Prince Jackson. The statue depicted Adralis standing tall, with a wise, calm expression, one hand resting on Jackson's shoulder. Jackson was carved with a soft smile, holding an open scroll in one hand and gesturing toward the villagers with the other. The unveiling ceremony was attended by villagers from every corner of Eldor. Eldrin stood before the crowd, his voice ringing out with solemnity. This statue is not just a tribute to the men we lost, but a reminder of the values they upheld: kindness, justice, and selflessness. Let this serve as a guide for all who follow. The villagers bowed their heads in silence, their hearts heavy with loss but buoyed by hope. Children ran around the statue, laughing and playing, as if the spirits of Jackson and Adralis were watching over them, ensuring their innocence endured. Eldor entered a period of renewal. With the rains nourishing the land, farmers harvested their first crops in years. Markets once again buzzed with activity, and the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as homes and public spaces were rebuilt. The kingdom, though scarred by its past, began to thrive. The elders, inspired by the lessons of the recent past, established a new system of governance. While a king or queen would still rule, they would be bound by a council of advisors chosen from among the people. This council would ensure that no ruler could repeat the mistakes of the past. As for Eldrin, he became a beloved figure in the kingdom, seen as the moral compass that had guided Eldor through its darkest days. Though he refused the title of king, his wisdom and leadership left an indelible mark on the people. Years later, rumors began to spread of a man wandering the outskirts of Eldor, offering aid to the poor and sick. He was described as humble, with a face lined by sorrow and wisdom. Some believed it was Kevin, seeking redemption for his sins. Though he never approached the kingdom again, villagers spoke of his quiet acts of kindness as proof that even the most broken souls could find a path to redemption. Eldor thrived, its people united by the memory of their trials and the lessons they had learned. The statue of Adralis and Jackson stood as a silent guardian in the heart of the kingdom, its shadow stretching over the square, as if to protect the land they had loved so dearly. And so, the tale of Eldor became a story passed down through generations, a story of betrayal and forgiveness, of the consequences of envy, and the enduring power of love and justice. The Kingdom of Eldor stood as a testament to resilience, a shining beacon in a world often shadowed by darkness.